Welcome to Dr. America here on the WEAC Radio Network. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, guys, this week we've got a really special episode because March 23rd marks the 5th anniversary of the Affordable Care Act being signed into law. This week and next week's episode, we are celebrating what Obamacare has accomplished. We're going to talk to people who are making it happen. We're going to talk to people who have had their lives transformed by this law. And we're going to learn what we need to do in the near and distant future to keep the good things coming from the Affordable Care Act and health policies that need to follow it. So I'm really excited for today's show. We've got a great show for you today, and we'll be talking to Felicia Williams, who is from North Carolina. She's done fantastic work with Moms Rising, and she's that organization, as you guys know, is a longtime friend and ally of the Dr. America show here on WEACT. So we're really excited to have Felicia on the program. And we're going to be hearing from some regular folks, some regular people all across the country who have had their lives changed by the Affordable Care Act. So I'm really excited to share those stories with you. And we're going to close out today's program with a top 5 list of the reasons you really should be celebrating the Affordable Care Act, but maybe you're not as familiar with those reasons. So stay tuned. We've got a lot in store for this show. Really excited about it because there's a lot happening right now with the Affordable Care Act. As you guys know, we were at the Supreme Court to cover King versus Burwell and the threats that poses to the health reform law, and now we're going to kind of pivot just a little bit to kind of focus on what the law has done for patients, for doctors, for our healthcare system. There's a lot to celebrate, and I'm really proud of how far this law has come along. I think that it's been a rough journey, but an interesting one. I feel that our fellow Americans have benefited tremendously from what all the Affordable Care Act has been able to bring to different parts of the country. And it still has a long way to go, and we've still got a rough journey ahead of us. But I think it's important to take the time to reflect on where we've been, what we've accomplished, and how we can use a lot of those lessons learned as we move forward to make health justice a reality for all of our fellow Americans across the country. So my first guest, I'm really excited to bring her on the program, is Miss Felicia Williams. She is an associate campaign director for Moms Rising's National Healthcare Campaign and serves on the board of North Carolina Women United. That's NC Women United. She has been an outspoken and diligent supporter of improving quality and access to healthcare services for nearly a decade. She lives in Raleigh, North Carolina with her family and holds a master's in public administration and public policy certificate from North Carolina State University. Felicia, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Sanjeev. Thanks so much for having me.
So, Felicia, I want to point our audience first to a fantastic article that you wrote in the Huffington Post. Guys, you got to check this out. It was just published on March 16th, and the headline is great. It's "Key Southern States Are Hearing from People They Left Out of Health Coverage." And Felicia does a fantastic job of just laying out, who are our fellow Americans in southern states who could stand to benefit from Medicaid expansion. And it's a fantastic read. We're going to post it on the comments section of this episode, and we're going to be tweeting it. Definitely read it if you haven't already. But Felicia, first off, thank you so much for writing this. This was, I think, it was just such compelling writing about what the Affordable Care Act means to our fellow Americans in the South. So, my first question really is really about how you got involved with Medicaid expansion. Clearly the article demonstrates your passion for advocating on this issue. And I'm just curious about how did you come to rally for Medicaid, and why does this matter mean so much to you?
Well, I think it's very common in my line of work for the people doing it to have a very personal connection to the issues that they're working on. And that's definitely the case in my situation. When my son was born in 2006, he had a very life-threatening illness that required me to quit my job to take care of him. And with my husband in law school at the time, we lost our health insurance when I quit my job. We were incredibly fortunate that my son qualified for Medicaid so that he could get the care that he needed. And he is alive today because of the life-saving treatment that he received. Thanks to Medicaid, I know firsthand what a big difference it can make for individuals. But right now, in my home state of North Carolina, our lawmakers have decided to arbitrarily cap the age at which they're willing to allow someone to receive help through Medicaid, to where basically only children and very, very low-income parents qualify. And if you're an adult without children, you basically have no options if you run into financial hardship at the same time you happen to experience medical catastrophe. And that was the case with my husband and I when we lost our insurance back in 2006. We ended up having to pay nearly a mortgage-sized payment for our own health insurance each month, and eventually had to sell our house and move in with family just to stay afloat while we were getting my son through his medical issues. We even had to go without health insurance for a while because I had a change in coverage with graduate school, which meant insurance companies could deny us because of some pre-existing conditions. So had we had access to Medicaid during those very, very difficult years of our life, things would have been so much different. We're very thankful that today we're all healthy, but still nearly 9 years later, we're crawling out of the financial hole that was created because of my son's illness.
Wow. And so, I mean, I just want the audience to kind of reflect on that for a second, that, had it not been for, Medicaid, I mean, your family would have had a much more tragic story to tell.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, we definitely would have drained our life savings, and I know that my in-laws and my parents and everybody would have done what they could to try to get him the medical care that they need, but it just was not within our power to get him. I mean, he was on chemotherapy for the first year of his life, and then it took us another few years just to catch him up to normal development with, various therapies. So he definitely would not have had nearly as good of an outcome,
right,
had we not had access to Medicaid.
Right. And, I think that, this really does kind of highlight so many important things for me, as both a doctor and as, a health advocate, is that, at times when families really should only be focused on helping their loved ones recover, our American healthcare system seems to, add an additional burden to the family finances, which, I just find that, it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing as an American that is what we, force families to endure when, Mother Nature has already kind of, thrown a major challenge on your path,
Yep, I could not agree more.
And, so I guess, so having walked the walk, I'm curious about what you learned along the way to writing this article for the Huffington Post about, Medicaid expansion. And, what surprised you when you were doing the research about Medicaid in the South and what it would mean for our fellow Americans there?
Well, what surprised me most, and I know I shouldn't be surprised by this after so many years of political gridlock, is just how incredibly bad of a decision these state legislatures are making for their states on purely ideological reasons. The data clearly show that expanding Medicaid is a win-win for states and the people who live in them. It's just bad public policy making that flies in the face of what we know, of what works to improve our healthcare system, our economy, and the lives of individuals. These states are refusing billions of dollars that have already been set aside to help improve the health and well-being of the people in their state. Let that sink in for a minute. The money's already there.
There, right. Yeah.
Waiting for them to accept it, and they're playing politics instead of bringing that money home.
And so, like that actually kind of makes me wonder, like, when you've done your activism and advocacy, for in the state legislatures, have you heard any legitimate policy concerns from these guys? Or when it comes to like Medicaid expansion, have you heard any legitimate policy concerns from these lawmakers? Or is this just anti-Obama politics at its worst?
The most disconcerting argument I've heard was from a state lawmaker here at our General Assembly who said that we just simply can't afford to help everyone who is sick. And I reminded her that the money is our own tax dollars that have already been set aside for the purpose, for that purpose.
Right.
And it's just waiting in Washington for us to accept it. But she didn't really seem convinced that the state and federal government can afford to, nor are able to work together to make sure that people have health insurance. But, we know that's not true because we've seen it happening in other states across the country. But other than that, no. Having looked at this issue from all different ways as a public policy professional, I can't see any concern that isn't at least able to be addressed. It really is just pure ideological blindness, and it's sad because people are literally dying because of this bad policy decision, and
right, and so and that actually
over
kind of
1,000 each year here in North Carolina.
Right, and and this is actually kind of like the next thing I wanted to hear about. I mean, like your family has already endured a major challenge, and Medicaid was of tremendous help on that struggle. I'm curious about the other families that you've met in North Carolina and what they've experienced, because I was looking at the eligibility for qualifying for North Carolina Medicaid. If you're a parent, like if you're making more than, I think it was $12,000 a year, then you no longer qualify for for Medicaid, and if you do not have children, you really don't qualify. And
right.
And that was just striking to me because that has to leave a lot of North Carolinians in really desperate times, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's 500,000 people actually who are waiting on health coverage, and I've heard personally quite a few really powerful stories, and I know quite a few people who have been affected adversely by this poor policy decision. One woman I know, Dana Wilson, from Charlotte, North Carolina, who's actually featured on the NC Left Me Out website, is battling multiple sclerosis. And so she's only able to work part-time due to her health struggles and doesn't have access to health insurance. And it's just really sad that she not only has to struggle with a chronic illness as debilitating as MS, but she also has to struggle through financial hardship just to get the care that she needs. And there's another woman I met last summer, Leslie Boyd, in Asheville, North Carolina, whose story affected me, I think, more personally than any I've encountered. And I'll tell it to you just really quick. Her son, Mike, was born with a birth defect that made him, 1, more susceptible to colon cancer, and 2, unable to get health insurance because this birth defect was considered a pre-existing condition. But without access to affordable health insurance for regular checkups, by the time they discovered his cancer, it was too late. And even though he couldn't get insurance through the individual marketplace, he also couldn't get insurance through Medicaid. And unfortunately, he passed away a few years back.
Oh,
so
wow.
Now, thanks to the ACA, people with pre-existing conditions like Mike had can no longer be denied access to coverage, but that doesn't help Leslie with the loss of her son.
Yeah.
And Mike was just about my age, actually, when he died, and I keep thinking, why was my son, as an infant, deemed more worthy for help by the state through Medicaid, which saved his life, but not Leslie's, because he was an adult? Surely we can't be there as a society, and no mother should have to bury her son because he didn't have access to medical insurance.
Right. I mean, and the thing about like that, that really touches me as a doctor because I've taken care of kids like Mike, and I think that it breaks my heart, and it really does. It makes me feel like my work as a pediatrician and as a physician and all the effort that I went through with med school and residency, it feels like a lot of that is just undermined because we don't have the kind of society that backs up our doctors and nurses who are really working hard to do the best for kids like Mike.
Mm-hmm.
And, to have like the kind of society that, describes exactly the kind of false choice that you're describing, that like, here's a child, here's an adult, they both need health care, but we seem to decide that we can't just help them both.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that really just crushes me because, like that's not like how that's not like the value system I went to med school with, like I went in with the attitude of like, I'm going to take care of everybody who needs my help. And,
right.
I really appreciate you sharing that story because I think it really does require a lot of American introspection to kind of like answer like, okay, like, is this really the kind of society that we live in? And it sounds like Left Me Out is pushing that. Which can you tell our audience more about about Left Me Out and what their goal is and how we can get involved?
Sure, absolutely. So the Left Me Out movement has actually been really inspiring for me to watch grow as I've seen it spread from Texas to Mississippi and now to here in North Carolina. Their broader purpose is to gather support for Medicaid expansion from state residents, advocacy organizations, hospitals, and even chambers of commerce in some states, which is great. But their primary purpose is to help lift up the voices of those who have been left out of affordable coverage by state lawmakers. The goal of these coalitions is to call on state lawmakers to do what is right by the people of their state and expand Medicaid to those who need it. So each state has their own website. For Texas, the web address is texasleftmeout.org. For Mississippi, it's msleftmeout.org. And for North Carolina, it's ncleftmeout.org. And I just want to encourage all of your listeners to go to those sites and sign up to stay up to date, even if you aren't affected by the Medicaid gap. And most importantly, people need to be calling their state lawmakers and letting them know that they support extension of Medicaid. Legislators really thrive on contact from their constituents to let them know what is most important to the people in their district. And I can't think of anything more important than keeping people healthy and making sure they have access to health care when they need it. And then one last thing, if you live here in North Carolina, next week on the 24th, we're having an advocacy day focused on Medicaid expansion, and that's a great opportunity for North Carolinians to not only learn about the issue from policy experts, but to meet with lawmakers face-to-face to discuss it. And you can find out more about that event on our blog at momsrising.org under healthcare.
Awesome. So you guys heard it here. These are fantastic opportunities to get involved and help your fellow Americans, and and let these lawmakers know these stories. Let them know that that it's your friends, it's your neighbors, it's the people you go to church with, the people that you have barbecues with, who are struggling under these false choices that are just simply un-American. This is not who we are as a people when it comes to healthcare. And Felicia, I thank you so much for writing, for doing the fantastic work that you do, and and consider us a teammate for all your folks in North Carolina. We're going to be there with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, guys, for listening. When we come back, we're going to be hearing some testimonials from some folks that we met over at the Supreme Court when we were talking about King versus Burwell. You don't want to miss those stories, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
All right, all right, all right. Welcome back to the Dr. America Show here on the We Act Radio Network. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram. I want to thank Felicia again so much for sharing her stories and experiences in North Carolina with expanding Medicaid. I think that, her on the ground and, from the curbside to the countryside experiences with advocating for Medicaid expansion really humanizes a really important issue for Obamacare as we move forward for the years to come. This is our special episode celebrating 5 years of the Affordable Care Act, and I want to share with you guys some stories that we got to hear when we took the show on the road and we were at the Supreme Court. And that was a couple of weeks ago when King versus Burwell was being argued before the justices. We got to hear from some really, wonderful people who had their lives completely transformed by being able to go to the doctor, sometimes for the first time in years. And, their stories are just so compelling, and I really want to make sure that you guys get a chance to hear from them, because these are ordinary Americans, just living their lives and, getting by and getting along as we all do. And they really made it come home for what the Affordable Care Act means for their day-to-day lives. So we got to hear from a young woman from Indiana, another one from Michigan, and another one from Pennsylvania. I think we really did get to hear from, different people from different parts of the country who really showed us that, the Affordable Care Act is about building the best of our American values into our healthcare system with justice and liberty for all. And I'm really proud to share these stories with you. So without further ado, let's get into that first story. We're with We Act Radio Network here at the Families USA Radio Row. Today, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments about King versus Burwell. It's the latest threat to the Affordable Care Act. And to help us make sense of it in a very personal way, I'm very pleased and excited to introduce you to my next guest, Mrs. Jenny Heitler Clevens. She is from Pennsylvania, just near Philadelphia, and I'm very excited for her to share her story about her family's journey with the Affordable Care Act and what King versus Burwell means to her. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so ma'am, you know that the Affordable Care Act is turning 5 years old at the end of this month. And for you and your family, what has the ACA meant to you guys?
Well, my husband and I are musicians. We work together, and we're self-employed, so we perform mostly for kids, and we go to a lot of schools and preschools and public places as well. And so we have to buy our own insurance, and we've been doing this now full-time for about 19 years. So we've been in the individual insurance market for a very long time. So we remember what it was like before the Affordable Care Act, and it was pretty much of a nightmare. I had cancer 5 years ago, breast cancer, and so I had just gotten new insurance. It was right around the time that, they were just passing it or just before they passed it. And so I was really worried that if they didn't pass it, maybe, something would happen to my insurance, or I would never be able to change insurance companies again because of this pre-existing condition. So that was a really big relief for me that, now I knew that I would be able to get health insurance no matter what.
Right.
I have twin sons who are now in college, and with the Affordable Care Act and the subsidies for the last 2 years, last year and then this year, our health insurance costs have gone way down, and that's been a huge relief for us.
So it sounds like, the Affordable Care Act has, meant so much to you, to your family, both in terms of health and in terms of your finances.
Absolutely.
And so, that kind of brings us to, King versus Burwell, because what's at stake is, the Supreme Court has to decide whether the tax subsidies that are going towards the federal exchanges are still going to keep coming. So, let's say, that the Supreme Court rules in favor of the plaintiffs and those subsidies stop, reaching families. What would that mean to, to your family if that happened?
It would be a big hardship because basically Right now, we are paying about $425 a month. This is for our family of 4. And we get about $650 of subsidies each month. So then our insurance would be bumped up to about $1,000 a month, and that would be huge. I don't think that we could afford it. We would have to, either decide to forego insurance or go back and see if we could figure out about getting a cheaper insurance, which wouldn't cover as much and would have a larger deductible and that kind of stuff.
And this is for a family where, like you were describing before, you and your husband are self-employed. You've always been working. You're, putting in those like hard hours. And I'm a pediatrician, so I appreciate what you guys are doing for these school kids and everything. From your perspective, like especially for, state of Pennsylvania, like you were describing, they're kind of going through this like political transition. Let's say the Supreme Court rules in favor of the Affordable Care Act, and these subsidies keep coming to the federal exchange. As a Pennsylvanian, family, what would you see as like kind of the next on the to-do list for Affordable Care Act and maybe for health policy in your state?
I think that what's happening now with the healthcare situation is that insurance companies are still trying to figure out the way that they can make the most money. And so there's all of the, they keep, like, we got a great plan last year, and then they told us that we couldn't keep going with that plan. We had to re-enroll and do a different plan. And then when I looked at the cost of that plan, they had increased the cost and reduced some of the services, and so it didn't make sense to go with that plan. So I went with a different plan, same company, but there's now all these co-pays and various, so there's sort of all these different ways that the insurance companies are still trying to make it difficult for people. And if there was a way that there could be more restrictions or more
well, it sounds like you're
ways that insurance companies can't jerk around people.
Right. So it sounds like they're really like like what families need is some accountability from these insurance companies about what are you doing with the last year's money, this year's money, next year's money. Like I totally hear you on this. On this need for accountability.
I know that one part of the Affordable Care Act, which has been really beneficial to us, is this idea where the insurance companies have to put 80% of the income that they get towards paying out.
Right. That's the medical loss ratio part of the law.
And we have actually gotten money back.
Oh, wow.
From that.
Okay.
So that, I think, is a really good thing. But there need to be some other accountability.
Okay. Well, hopefully from your lips to the Supreme Court's ears. Thank you so much for sharing your family's story, because I think it kind of like starts to humanize what would otherwise be like kind of a lofty kind of legal policy kind of conversation, and brings it down to some very human, very family oriented terms that we can all understand. Right. Because we've all got kind of a stake in this, regardless of where we got our health insurance or regardless of what our health status might be. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate hearing from you guys. And we've been listening to the WEAC Radio Network here at Families USA Radio Row. We'll be right back.
You're listening to WEACT Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
All right, welcome back, everybody. We are listening to the WEAC Radio Network here on Families USA's Radio Row. Today, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments from King versus Burwell. This is the Supreme Court case that is the latest threat to the Affordable Care Act. And with me today and right now, we have Miss Kathy Koja. She is someone who's going to share with us her insights about her personal experiences with the Affordable Care Act, what's at stake with King v. Burwell, and her experiences as a healthcare consumer. So we're really excited to have you on the show, Kathy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Kathy, the Affordable Care Act is going to turn 5 years old, at the end of this month. And so, like, when you look back at these last 5 years that the law has been in place, what has it meant for you, for your health, and for your experiences with the healthcare system?
Well, in the beginning, it was sort of too good to be true. It's like, seriously, I can get affordable health care, and there might even be a subsidy that will help me afford the affordable health care. Come on, like, what is the catch, right? And I'm a writer and let's call it a micro business person.
Okay.
I'm a freelance writer and producer, and these kind of expenses for healthcare can devastate someone like me. And my husband is also a freelance content creator, and a large expense could not only kill us, it can kill our businesses. So being able to afford decent health care. We had a health care plan that we were paying for that was basically, if you're hit by a train, maybe it will become worthwhile. Other than that, you have no prescription coverage, you have no...
So it wasn't really about wellness or, like, enhancing your health and well-being or anything like that.
Not even a little.
So that was really like, if like catastrophe struck, that plan will eventually help you out a little bit.
Right. It will probably keep me totally out of the poorhouse, but other than that, don't expect much.
Okay, so then along comes the Affordable Care Act, and what changes for you guys?
Everything changes for us. Literally, when we applied, and especially because of the subsidies, when I saw the level of care that we would qualify for and that we were eligible for a subsidy, I cried. I mean, it sounds like, it sounds corny, but it's true. I'm like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This is fantastic. So we have had occasion to use it twice for normal health maintenance. It's like a miracle.
That's fantastic. So, so this actually went from being, like a financial burden to actually being something that was, in your family's life as, like, kind of a health advancement.
Absolutely. And it also encourages you to take charge of your health and to make sure that you don't end up with a catastrophic situation, because the care is available.
Right. So you were able to, go to the doctor when you wanted to, not when you had to, and
right.
maybe even both.
Wait till your arm is like falling out of its socket to go, I should probably take care of this.
Yeah.
And having I don't know that people who have not lived with that uncertainty can quite understand that constant low-level thrum of anxiety, like, oh, I have a cough, but is it a bad cough?
Right.
Oh, I slipped and fell on my porch, but is it really bad? How can I wait? Can I not go in? That's really debilitating to live with that kind of anxiety.
Yeah, because it sounds like, because like what's under that anxiety, at least from, what I'm gathering, is that you're having to kind of decide, well, okay, here's my health on the one hand, and then there's my finances on the other hand, and is it worth hurting one to help the other?
Right, and being put in that position day after day, year after year, is really stressful.
Yeah, I can. So you were saying that this was both you and your husband were,
yes.
In this boat together with
yes.
this. And so the Affordable Care Act comes along, and were you able to get insurance through a federal exchange, like healthcare.gov?
Yes.
Okay.
And actually, after all the hysteria for the rollout, I found working with a facilitator to be completely... The process was streamlined for us. Spoke to them beforehand. What should we do? What should we know? Like, before you log in, have some idea what you want. We were done in 20 minutes.
Oh, okay.
I have had far worse customer service with almost anyone. That think of your cable company, right? You wish you were off the phone in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
No,
it takes me 20 minutes just to get like a representative on the line.
Not even a person, right? Just to get in the tree. So, no, I found a lot of that worried to be.
So this was like an in-person person, or was this on the phone?
It was a phone person.
Okay, so that's
And-
so that's great. So this is like a person on the phone is walking, you and your husband through your health needs, so that when you actually do kind of have to make the formal application,
And explaining, know sort of what you want before you.
Mm-hmm.
What was your previous health care? What would you like going in? What's important to you? And once we knew those facts, it was really easy.
Okay, and so that was that sounds like about like the fall of 2013, like fall autumn time of 2013.
Right, the end of 2013.
Okay, and then like over the course of 2014, when you actually were enrolled and were able to use the plan, so tell me.
No
about
one can
those...
see my big smile, my big grin, right?
But tell me about those experiences, because how did that compare to like when because you were previously insured?
We were previously insured, and I ended up having to let that insurance go because the premiums were so high and the value that we were getting was nil. Just for one example, we had no prescription coverage.
Okay.
And it is amazing how even by thinking, okay, can we get them to prescribe a generic? Oh no, there's no generic available for this, blah, blah, blah. Even an expense like that is bizarre. And so
Right.
being able to see, on my healthcare card, the little RX, it's like,
Yeah.
so it's like catching up on maintenance and saying, oh, I need to go in and have, this and this and this done because I've been putting it off for years.
For such a
right?
long time. Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like your 2014 was like a pretty good year for your health.
Pretty awesome.
Yeah, and so now this brings us to March of 2015, and we've got King versus Burwell being argued today at the court. And so what's at stake for you in this case?
If we lose the subsidy, we will lose our health care, period.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It is not affordable. It is not affordable for us financially, and that means that whole load of worry that we didn't have to carry for 2014 is coming straight back like a tidal wave.
Okay. And so, it sounds like you're going to be like right back into those false choices of having to like look at your finances, look at your health, and kind
Absolutely.
of, and have to, pick like that.
And balance it out, which is really, it is a false choice. And especially as a citizen, what makes us productive and helpful citizens to the country is being able to do our jobs and to live our lives in a way that helps the economy and doesn't hurt it. So taking away the subsidy, it's not like you're giving us something that we're just kind of living fat and happy on our health care, right? And having
Right.
useless tests and going
Right,
crazy,
right.
taking pills.
Right.
We need this to live, and if we have the peace of mind that affordable health care provides, we can do our jobs.
Right,
If
because
something
it
happens,
doesn't
we can
sound
take care
like
of it.
it doesn't sound like you or your husband were going on like a crazy shopping spree at the clinic or anything.
It's like, give me an
that.
extra arm, give me a
Right,
couple
right,
extra
yeah,
legs. It's like, yeah, not really.
No, you didn't you didn't go in for like the third set of eyeballs or anything like that.
Not even a
Okay.
little bit, no.
Yeah.
So you're like, if we don't have this worry, this is just it's a giant uncertainty that we don't have to carry going forward in our
because
lives.
this is really, managing your healthcare and managing family finances isn't meant to be anybody's, third or fourth job in addition to all the other work that, they have to do or want to do. And and it sounds like this was actually freeing up some very much needed creative time
Absolutely.
for the kind of work that you and your husband do.
I know a lot of, we call ourselves micro businesses because I do know a lot of artists, content creators, small business people who are a one-person shop. And if something does happen to you health-wise, not only is that a burden and cost, you can't work.
Right.
So you're falling behind on jobs that you have contracted for or work that you're supposed to be doing. You're sick, you have to close up shop. That is terrifying.
Right.
And are you going to, how badly is that going to impact your career?
And so it sounds like, you're doing what I think what a lot of American conservatives would want you and your husband to do, and that is pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. And,
We do nothing but bootstrap.
And then here comes along this law, which is really actually one of the bootstraps in a way.
Absolutely. And
And-
it makes us more productive citizens and tax-paying citizens. I would think that would be completely in line with the conservative agenda.
Right. So it sounds like if the court decides to, to take away these subsidies, families like yours are going to be in real hot water. And what state do you live in?
We're in Michigan.
Okay. And have you heard anything from the people in Michigan about anything that might be done as like a backup plan? Has anything gotten back to?
I think most people are hoping and believing that the court will do the right thing. And understanding how this impacts so many, many, many families. And I'm from the Detroit area, and Detroit has carried an enormous burden, an enormous financial burden throughout the recession, and has struggled to come back, and people there really don't need an extra, cross to carry.
Right. So, I mean, it sounds like, as this, economy is, just barely, getting back to its feet again for, ordinary Americans, not like the Wall Street folks, but, for regular folks who are out there, it sounds like the affordable part of the Affordable Care Act is actually a reality.
Absolutely.
And I'm hoping that the Supreme Court is going to do the right thing and back us up, because it sounds like this is the kind of thing that really should be transcending a lot of our political
Yeah, I can't understand how you could be against this unless you had perhaps some other agenda that you wanted to see the Affordable Care Act fail for some reasons of your own that have nothing to do with consumers and health care.
Oh, but that
I can't
happens.
imagine that could happen. But let's say there were some crazy people like that. I would ask them to come and spend some time with me and with my friends and with the people who do what we do every day, and see what it's like to live without it, and see what it's like to have that level of anxiety for yourself and your family, and then look me in the face and tell me that this is a good idea.
Right. Well, Kathy, I want to thank you for joining us today. I think it's this conversation was really helpful to kind of help us realize that we've come a long way since those false choices of health versus wealth, and I'm really appreciative of your story. I think this is really helpful.
Well, thank you. I'm glad for the chance to tell it.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, guys. This is the We Act Radio Network here on Families USA's Radio Row, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Welcome back. We are the We Act Radio Network here at Families USA Radio Row. Today, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments about King versus Burwell, the latest Supreme Court case to threaten the Affordable Care Act. And with us today, we have Miss Laura Hayes. She's come all the way from Indiana to tell us her story about how the Affordable Care Act has impacted her life. And so thank you so much for joining us today, Laura.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so Laura, you know that the Affordable Care Act is going to be turning 5 years old at the end of this month. And since it was enacted, what has it meant for, your health or for the health of your family?
I'm the only member of my family that I know of on the marketplace. I gained the marketplace back in 2014. I started arguing with the marketplace in October of 2013, but with all the glitches. When it finally came through in March, I burst into tears. I had my whole family terrified. They were all, "Are you okay? Is your back acting up? Is something wrong? Did you have an anxiety attack?" "No, I have insurance."
So those were tears of joy then?
Yes, decidedly. I was part of an abusive relationship, and I suffer post-traumatic stress disorder from that. I was having nightmares every night, waking up, gasping for breath, heart racing, convinced I was right back where I'd started. I suffer from degenerative disc disease, as well as extreme arthritis and endometriosis and polycystic ovary syndrome, and chronic migraines.
Okay.
So since I've been part of the marketplace, I see a therapist, I see a psychiatrist, the nightmares have stopped, I'm seeing a pain specialist on a regular basis. It just moved me forward so far in my life.
So it sounds like the Affordable Care Act has meant a lot to your personal health.
Yes, it has, decidedly.
And so in the state of Indiana, there's a federal exchange. The state does not have its own exchange.
Correct, and I was informed a couple days ago that our governor has said that if the federal one is dropped, he will not instate one for the state.
Okay, so Indiana has actually got a whole lot at stake,
Yes.
with King versus Burwell, because these tax subsidies, which actually keep health insurance affordable,
Right.
are what's at stake, because what the Supreme Court has to decide is whether only the state-based exchange and not the federal exchanges are going to qualify for.
Right, yes. Before the marketplace came about, I was looking at $900 per month insurance fees. Not to mention the fact that they wouldn't cover any of my pre-existings. And I'd have to pay for all of my co-pays and deductibles and everything on top of that, which is just unreasonable. That's twice what I was paying in rent at the time.
Wow. So, it sounds like you were being faced with these choices of either it's going to be your health or your finances.
I didn't even make that much money.
Wow.
It was not even possible. So I soldiered on. I kept going. I didn't see doctors unless I had absolutely no other choice. And usually it was unconscious, taken into an emergency room by someone else.
Oh, wow. Okay, so, there's so much at stake then for you personally.
Yes, very much so.
For this particular Supreme Court case of King versus Burwell.
Yes.
So, let's kind of run through the what-if scenarios. So, what if, the Supreme Court sees in favor of the plaintiffs and they decide that the federal government can no longer offer tax subsidies through the federal exchange? What does that mean for you?
I suspect the first thing to return will be the pain. And I foresee myself winding up in my house. Most of the time, I won't be able to continue with my second job.
Wow.
I don't even know if I'll be able to keep up with my first one. I had hit a point with the nightmares where I was sleeping maybe 6 hours a week total because I just couldn't function. And I seriously wonder how long it will take me to break. I've made it this far. I've pushed, but everyone has a breaking point.
Sure. No, but it sounds like, the Affordable Care Act has given you a chance to persevere.
Yes,
and
very much so.
And so, it sounds like these consequences could be very dire, but they don't have to be.
They don't have to be at all. I think the portion that would break me is the fact that I've seen a better place. I go out with my sister and my roommate and, we explore the conservatory, we go to the park, I walk my dog, which 2 years ago was not possible. I walked to the end of the block, my back gave out and I fell over. So,
wow.
But, I can walk her now. I can do things when I haven't just twisted my ankle. And it's not necessary for me to go back there. I think that's the part that's so heartbreaking about this, is it's not necessary that I wind up back in that place.
Right. Yeah, no, and I think that this is actually kind of like the powerful lesson that for a lot of us, with the Affordable Care Act, to learn is that, more than the health care, it's the quality of life, it's
Very
the
much
peace
so.
of mind, it's not having to be put in these, awful, false choice circumstances of picking your health versus, your finances.
I'm actually headed into court later this month over emergency room fees from before I had insurance because I haven't been able to keep up with the payments. So, it's so much that this affects. It's not just, well, can this person go to a doctor? It's, can they keep working? Can they stay an active part of the community? Can they? And I see it from both sides. I'm a medical receptionist. And I can think of at least 5 patients off the top of my head who have the marketplace now, who were having to subsist on the minimalist of care that they absolutely had to have. And, they're doing so much better. I see people coming in with new jobs. I see them moving forward. A goal for America has been we want to get people independent. We don't want them to have to rely on someone else.
Right.
And that's what this is allowing people to do.
Right. It's to actually persevere and tap into their inner strength and
Very much so.
and build their own American dream on their own terms.
Precisely.
Okay. Well, I guess one of the things that I'm curious about is that let's say that the Supreme Court, sees in favor of the federal government and those tax subsidies are able to keep, coming through the exchange. from your perspective, would you say that you see some new challenges for the Affordable Care Act to work on, to improve on, like room for areas of improvement, or things that you feel might be like, the next important thing for us to take care of policy-wise?
I think that it's moving forward very well. It's a lot easier than it was in 2013 when you first registered. Registering at the end of 2014 was almost painless.
Okay.
I started application process and finished it under an hour.
Okay.
So it was utterly wonderful.
And that's just in a year.
Precisely. And personally, my plan jumped so much. I went from an $850 deductible to a $150 deductible.
Wow.
Which is unbelievable. And
Right.
that $850 was still hard for me to reach, but I did it.
Right.
It wasn't impossible. The $150 makes my life 6 kinds of easier, especially since I just moved.
Right.
Which is expensive.
Yeah, no, and I think that, bringing up things like moving actually just sort of emphasizes that point that, this is not meant to be the kind, that healthcare and, taking care of ourselves is not meant to be the kind of thing that is this burden on the rest of our lives.
It shouldn't be, no. Your health is something that you should watch. It's something you should care for. But it shouldn't be something that holds you back.
Right.
It shouldn't.
Yeah. Well, Laura, thank you so much for joining us today on the show. We really appreciate hearing your insights and hearing your story. Thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciated the opportunity.
All right, great. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are the We Act Radio Network here at Families USA Radio Row to hear the participating with the Supreme Court's arguments on King versus Burwell. We'll be right back.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
All right. Welcome back to the Dr. America show here on the We Act Radio Network. I am your host, Dr. Sanjeev Sriram, and I am glad to wrap up the first part of our special on the 5th birthday of Obamacare. We're really, celebrating this important piece of health policy that passed in 2010, and March 23rd marks the 5th anniversary of the law. So I want to thank my guests. I want to thank Felicia Williams from Moms Rising for joining us and sharing such, a powerful set of stories about the importance of Medicaid expansion in North Carolina, and for reminding us about the 4 million Americans still in the coverage gap. And I want to thank my fellow Americans who I met at the Supreme Court who shared their stories about what the Affordable Care Act has meant to their lives. And I thank you for sharing what you did at the Supreme Court. I think that those are the stories that that show us just how much the Obamacare has meant to our everyday Americans. And I thank you for speaking up. So I want to leave you guys with one last piece, and that is my top 5 reasons you really, really should celebrate Obamacare. I think there's going to be a lot of statistics and facts and figures that are thrown at you guys, but I want to kind of bring it home to these 5 points that I thought are possibly going to get lost in the discussion. I don't want you guys to miss it. So starting out with number 5, one of the big accomplishments of the Affordable Care Act is that caring for your health won't cost you your wealth. For the first time in 50 years, people are not double-checking their pocketbook before they decide to go to the doctor. According to the Commonwealth Fund, back in 2012, there were 80 million working-age adults who reported at least one cost-related problem accessing needed health care. And last year, That number was 66 million. Still a lot of people, but to see that big of a reduction from 80 million to 66 million, that's really thanks to the Affordable Care Act making sure that the money that goes into the healthcare system is actually going towards people's healthcare. So that means 14 million fewer people were delaying their healthcare because they were worried about the cost of that care. So, this is huge for family economies across the country. And, the fact that we're having fewer problems paying our medical bills is a major accomplishment of the Affordable Care Act, and it's one worth celebrating. So that's my number 5. Number 4, is really all about women's health. Okay, so the reason why this is a big accomplishment is that plans are no longer allowed to use gender when they determine rates, meaning that women are no longer paying more for their health insurance just because they're women. There's a full range of preventive health services that are being covered, and these are saving lives. They're strengthening the health of millions of Americans. And these preventive services, they include prenatal care, breast cancer and cervical cancer screening, genetic testing and counseling for women who are at high risk for breast cancer, contraceptive counseling services and supplies, including prescriptions for FDA-approved contraceptives, breastfeeding counseling and support services, including breast pump rental, and intimate partner violence screening and counseling. I want to go on a small tangent here. Some people, like Charles Krauthammer on Fox Noise and a whole lot of others, they're saying things like, they don't see the point of having to pay full price health insurance when they don't need things like lactation consulting. So why should they pay for it? Enough with the misogyny, okay? Honestly, when it comes to health insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, you name it, these things depend on risk pooling. So what that means is that we all have to put in a little bit into the pot so that none of us are financially ruined because of an illness. So Charles Krauthammer on Fox Noise, that means that there are lesbians having to pay for your erectile dysfunction medication. They have to pay for your prostate cancer screening. And may I remind you that you just turned 65 this past week, so that means that my tax dollars are covering your Medicare, whether I like you or not. And this is the thing what it means to be in our healthcare system with risk pooling. If anything, think of it as united we stand in a living day-to-day form. This is what we got to do for each other, and quite frankly, I'm proud of the Affordable Care Act making these preventive healthcare services for women affordable so that our sisters can get the care that they need and not have to worry about the cost. Okay, so that was number 4. Number 3, this one's actually kind of impressive. Number 3 is that people living in Republican counties are benefiting from Obamacare, and sometimes they are benefiting more than people living in Democrat counties. Now, stick with me on this one. The New York Times looked at data this past fall about who was getting insured and who was not, where they lived, all that kind of stuff. Now, before the Affordable Care Act, 18.5% of people living in Republican counties were uninsured. Now, 13.1% of people are living in Republican counties without health insurance, and that number keeps on dropping. That's not even considering the insured during the more recent open enrollment period. So there's a pretty good chance that number is going to drop and drop and drop. But we're talking about 18.5% of people without health insurance in Republican counties before Obamacare, and now we've got 13.1%. So that's a pretty significant drop, and it is thanks to the Affordable Care Act. And, it actually kind of points out why it's so ugly and stupid to play politics when it comes to this law. The law is helping people regardless of their political ideology, and it would work even better if we agreed to just put ideology aside and do what the law was intended to do, and that is make the human right of seeing a doctor when you need one possible for every American. All right, so, that little, political, paradox or anomaly, I guess you could call it, is my number 3. My number 2 is a shout out to Medicaid. Medicaid is doing wonders under the Affordable Care Act, and you're probably not going to hear enough about Medicaid when it comes time to celebrate Obamacare. So let me lay it out for you. Since those exchanges opened up back in October of 2013, those exchanges actually also directed people whose incomes qualified them under the Medicaid expansion to get enrolled in Medicaid. So now here we are, a couple of years later, and we have 7,857,000 Americans. That's 7,857,000 Americans who are enrolled in Medicaid in those states that chose to expand and allow people who are now making 138% of the federal poverty level, or about $33,000 for a family of four. Those families are now getting coverage because of Medicaid expansion. Medicaid is doing a fantastic job in the Affordable Care Act, and it really ought to be celebrated more and more and more. If you look at the people in Medicaid, they will tell you that, when they actually survey folks, they are finding that people are happy with the care that they're getting, that they are able to find a usual source of care, that they're not having the trouble finding the specialists that they thought that they were going to have before, and they are using the emergency room less and less. So Medicaid is actually doing wonders for the Affordable Care Act. It does not deserve the treatment that it's getting in the Republican budget right now, and I really hope you guys will keep pushing for Medicaid as it currently stands in a lot of states. I hope we keep building on it, and I hope those states that are not expanding Medicaid will see the light and offer health justice to millions of Americans. Okay, and that brings us to my number one reason to celebrate Obamacare that maybe you're not hearing enough about. All right, and here it is. My reason number one is that the Affordable Care Act is a civil rights victory. And honestly, this is the part of the Affordable Care Act that I love the very most. And that really is that prior to the Affordable Care Act, African Americans and Latino Americans made up a disproportionate number of the uninsured, made up a disproportionate number of the people without health insurance. They were more likely to not have health insurance because they worked at jobs where their employer was not sponsoring coverage. And when you when you look at what the Affordable Care Act has been able to offer communities of color, for African Americans, the uninsured rate fell from 22.4% to 13.2%. That's a 9-point drop in the uninsurance rate for African Americans. For Latino Americans, that number did even better. It went from 41.8% to 29.5%. We're talking about, an incredible amount of healthcare coverage that is happening because of the Affordable Care Act, and it's largely because of Medicaid expansion in those states that I was talking to you about. But I can tell you right now that the job is not over. We've got 4 million of our fellow Americans who are stuck in that coverage gap, meaning that their incomes are too high to qualify for their state's Medicaid, but they're not earning enough to shop in the federal exchanges. So there's 4 million of Americans who are stuck in that coverage gap who don't need to be. If Medicaid was expanded, these 4 million would actually have their health insurance, and those 4 million are actually still showing us what a civil rights injustice is being done, because when you look at those 4 million, 26% of them are African American and 24% of them are Latino. So we are actually finding that these disparities in care can be wiped out if we expand Medicaid. And so, as much as I'm pointing out these as causes to celebrate, I hope that my top 5 is giving you guys reasons to actually, stay active, stay on top of your lawmakers. Let's keep building this healthcare system for all of us, because honestly, we can do better. We must do better. We're Americans and we need to act like it. I want to thank you guys for joining me today for this Affordable Care Act 5th anniversary celebration special. We're going to have a part 2 next week. You guys definitely want to tune in for that. I want to thank my guests. I want to thank my team here at WEAC Radio, and we look forward to having you guys again on Dr. America here on the WEAC Radio Network. Thanks so much for joining us.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.